Okay, so um, it's kind of a good example of how you can actually make it like a simulation and actually make it pretty realistic, thus have external validity even in a lab study. So they're looking at different kinds of attachment there, um, how the child reacts to being away from their mother. Um, and in terms of this study, it obviously be very important when actually looking at the reaction to consider the psychological realism. Um, if we're interested in studying children's or pre younger children's reactions to being taken away from their mothers, kind of their emotional reaction, well, it's pretty important that that is somewhat realistic. So, is it actually their mother that's doing the study? I think it was in that example. Um, are they actually experiencing what they would experience in the real world being away from their mother? And it certainly looked like it in that study. Um, the physical conditions, again, the importance of these different factors can depend a lot on your particular study, what your goals are. There might be examples where you don't really care about physical conditions being the same. Um, it all just. But in that particular study, it kind of looked like they did also do a good job of mimicking real world settings. So, kid was kind of around a bunch of toys and carpet area to play, which which might be kind of how they spend a lot of their time in the real world. And then their mother could leave the room or do whatever. So overall, it's a pretty realistic study. And this is kind of what we mean again, where although there can be a trade-off, there isn't always a trade-off. Sometimes you can do a good job and make it so that even a carefully controlled um, lab experiment is still very realistic psychologically and in terms of physical conditions. Um, one way to, or one other way to kind of boost external validity, to boost realism, is to conduct what's known as a field study, or rather a field experiment or a naturalistic study. Um, hate to kind of bounce too much between topics, but that's just kind of the way it works with teaching this stuff with research. This particular topic of research methodology, things kind of are very interrelated. But we'll talk about observations later. But that might be one example of where um, uh, you really boost external validity. So that's what we mean by a naturalistic study is just kind of, or a field experiment is testing something in its normal setting, in its, the way it occurs in the real world. This is obviously going to be very high on external validity because you don't have to worry about improving, the physical realism or the psychological, well, probably not the psychological realism because you're testing it kind of as it occurs in the real world. Again, this is going to really be high on external validity. To give you some examples, let's say I wanted to know, um, did people recycle or not? Well, I mean, you could ask people about that, but for one, maybe people lie, maybe people don't really know or don't remember or don't have a good gauge of how much they recycle. So a way around that would be to test it in a naturalistic environment and just, hang out by a recycling bin and see how many people put things in the right bin or recycle when they should or whatever, however you decide to define it. There's also kind of an extension of that, and that would be really beneficial because people don't even necessarily know. Well, they shouldn't really know you're there. Um, so you're going to get kind of an unbiased, natural observation of what you're studying compared to say like asking them after the fact. Okay, and then kind of an extension of this is to run field experiment. So this is where, unlike an observation, you actually do still manipulate something. You do still have an independent variable, but it occurs, in the real world, in the natural setting. So to give you an example, if I was interested in a lot of education things tend to occur as field experiments. So let's say I wanted to look at, again, taking practice exams as an effective study method. Well, that's something I could definitely run probably as a field experiment. I could, I got ethics approval, um, get certain professors to give half their class practice exams and half their class restudying techniques, and see, what are how do their exam performances compare. That might be a field experiment. Again, that would be very realistic because it's kind of testing testing it in the real world in its natural setting. Another example, let's say I wanted to look at, um, you know, people bystander effects or people's tendency to help. So like if you're lying on the sidewalk, you look like you're in pain, what's going to influence whether people are going to help you or not, or just walk past you? Well, let's say I could run that in the actual field, and I could manipulate some factor like, say, the age of the person in trouble, or the gender, or whatever. That would be, again, a field experiment. It's, again, very realistic because it's in a setting. Obviously, the downside of this all is going to be that there's only so many things you can manipulate in a natural setting. At least with experiments, you can do correlations, but with experiments, there's some stuff that's pretty tough to do as field experiments. Obviously, something like cell phones and driving, can't run that ethically as a field experiment. I can't tell people do this thing that might get you in a car crash. I could look at that correlationally, just ask people, do you drive with a cell phone? Have you ever been in an accident? Run some kind of correlation there, but I can't manipulate that because it's, harmful or potentially harmful. So yeah, bottom line is that there's a limit to what you can do as field experiments. So think for a second, again, just to review, remember that external validity is preferable is most important with applied research. Internal validity is important for both, but external validity can be less important for basic research, theoretical research. When you're boosting the external validity, you might have less control over extraneous variables or confounds, stuff like that. And it could affect the internal validity of the study. More control means more internal validity, potentially less external. Just something to close on. So again, think about whether your particular research question, does external validity matter? So something like theories of memory, probably not. Something like anxiety and social interaction, probably yeah. Something like eyewitnesses, yeah, external validity is probably very important there. We'd want to know, is the situation realistic? You might get different results in a carefully controlled lab experiment with eyewitnesses or mock eyewitnesses than you would in the real world. So that's always something to consider. Okay, that's it for this week.